Is there no one competent in this room? The question didn't sound loud, but it cut through the air like a quiet verdict, and just like that, every voice at the table disappeared, replaced by the soft clink of glass and the hum of a $2,000 espresso machine in the corner. Ethan Caldwell leaned back in his chair, fingers resting lightly on the edge of the polished oak table, his tailored suit untouched by the tension he had just created, his expression calm, almost bored, as if he had asked this question 100 times before and always expected the same disappointing answer. Around him, executives shifted in their seats, men and women who managed billion-dollar portfolios and negotiated deals across continents, now suddenly unsure, their earlier confidence dissolving into polite silence, eyes dropping to notebooks, to tablets, to anything but him. The question itself lingered in the air, complex, layered, deliberately constructed to expose weakness rather than invite discussion, a test disguised as curiosity, the kind only someone used to control would ask. Near the edge of the room, unnoticed by everyone except the flicker of overhead lights reflecting off a tray of water glasses, Lily Carter stood perfectly still, her posture straight, her expression neutral, as if she had become part of the background long ago and learned never to step out of it. She had been moving quietly between tables for the past 2 hours, refilling glasses, adjusting silverware, listening without appearing to listen, her presence acknowledged only when something was needed and forgotten the moment it was done. No one had asked her name. No one had looked twice. And yet, her eyes had not missed a single word. Ethan's gaze swept the room again, slower this time, sharper, searching for resistance, for anyone willing to challenge him, but finding none, only lowered eyes and the faint discomfort of people realizing they had been measured and found lacking. He let out a soft breath, not quite a sigh, more like confirmation, and reached for his glass, the ice shifting with a quiet crack that somehow sounded louder than it should have. "That's what I thought," he said, not raising his voice. Not needing to, because the silence did the work for him. At the far end of the table, one of the senior analysts cleared his throat, attempting something, anything, a partial answer wrapped in hesitation, but it unraveled before it could even take shape, words trailing off into uncertainty, and Ethan didn't interrupt, didn't correct, didn't even react, which somehow made it worse. Because indifference, in that moment, felt heavier than criticism. Lily took a step forward, then stopped, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the tray, not out of fear, but calculation, as if measuring the weight of a decision no one else in the room even realized existed. The lights above flickered once, briefly, casting a shifting glow across the table, and in that second, something changed, not in the room, not yet, but in the quiet space between what was said and what was understood. She exhaled slowly, almost silently, her voice when it came barely above a whisper, steady, precise, impossible to ignore. "That assumption is wrong." And just like that, every head turned. For a moment, no one moved, as if the room itself needed time to understand what had just happened, because the voice had not come from the table, not from any of the executives, not from anyone Ethan Caldwell had been measuring, but from somewhere behind them, somewhere that did not belong in the conversation. Ethan's eyes shifted, slowly, deliberately, until they landed on her, and for the first time since he had walked into the room, his focus changed, not dramatically, not enough for most to notice, but enough to silence even the faint rustle of paper near the far end of the table. Lily Carter did not step forward immediately. She did not rush to explain. She simply stood there, one hand still holding the tray, her posture composed, her expression untouched by the sudden weight of attention, as if she had not interrupted a room full of powerful people, as if she had only stated something simple, something obvious. A few executives exchanged quick glances, uncertain whether this was a mistake or something else entirely, while the analyst who had just failed leaned back slightly, relief and embarrassment mixing in equal measure across his face. Ethan did not speak right away, which in itself felt unusual, because he was not a man who hesitated, not a man who allowed silence to linger without purpose. But now he watched her, studying not just what she had said, but how she had said it, the steadiness, the lack of apology, the absence of hesitation that most people in this room had just displayed. "Explain," he said finally, his tone even, not sharp, not dismissive, but controlled, as if granting her exactly one chance and nothing more. Lily set the tray down carefully on the nearest side table, the soft contact of glass against wood echoing just enough to mark the shift, and then she stepped closer, not too close, just enough to be heard without raising her voice. The model assumes a stable correlation that has not existed for at least 18 months, she said, her words clear, unhurried, as if she had rehearsed them long before this moment, even though she had not. A few heads lifted, brows tightening, because this was not a guess, not a vague correction. This was specific, precise, and Ethan's fingers stilled against the table. She continued before anyone could interrupt, not louder, but firmer. You are basing your projection on pre-adjustment data, but the shift in emerging markets changed the baseline entirely, so the question itself does not hold. The room did not react all at once. It unraveled slowly, like a realization spreading from one corner to another, eyes moving from her to Ethan, from Ethan back to the data in front of them, pieces connecting where they had not before. Someone reached for a tablet, scrolling quickly. Another flipped through printed reports, and the analyst who had spoken earlier stared at his notes, as if seeing them for the first time. Ethan did not look away from her, not even when one of his senior partners leaned in slightly, as if about to say something, then stopped, because whatever this was, it was no longer a simple interruption. "And your answer?" Ethan asked, quieter now, not because he needed to be heard, but because the room had already given him its full attention. Lily met his gaze, not challengingly, not submissively, just directly, and for a brief second, the distance between them felt smaller than it should have been. "There is no correct answer," she said. "Not to that question. Not anymore." And this time, no one tried to speak after her. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt heavy, as if the air itself had thickened, pressing gently against every person in the room, forcing them to reconsider something they had accepted just minutes ago without question. One of the partners finally broke, not with confidence, but with curiosity. "That cannot be right," he said, though his voice lacked the certainty it carried earlier, and even he seemed to hear the difference. Lily did not turn toward him. She did not defend herself. She simply remained where she was, steady, allowing the weight of her statement to stand on its own. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his fingers now interlocked, resting against his lips, his eyes narrowing not in dismissal, but in calculation, as if he were reconstructing the question in his mind piece by piece, searching for the flaw she had exposed. Across the table, screens lit up, numbers were rechecked, assumptions revisited, and for the first time since the meeting began, the room no longer revolved around Ethan's authority, but around a possibility that he might have missed something. "Run the adjusted baseline," one of the analysts said quietly, almost to himself, his fingers moving quickly across the keyboard, the soft tapping filling the silence in a way that felt louder than any argument could have been. Seconds passed, then a minute, and then his expression changed, subtle at first, then undeniable. He sat back slowly, eyes fixed on the screen, as if confirming it a second time would somehow change the result. It did not. "She is right," he said, the words landing carefully, as if he understood their weight the moment they left his mouth. A ripple moved through the room, not loud, not chaotic, but undeniable, a shift in posture, in breath, in awareness, because this was no longer theoretical. Ethan's gaze did not leave Lily, even as the confirmation spread, even as another analyst quietly repeated the calculation and reached the same conclusion. "You are telling me," Ethan said finally, his voice calm but lower now, more focused, "that the entire projection we built this meeting on is invalid." No one answered him, not because they did not know, but because the answer had already been given. Lily nodded once, a small movement, controlled, respectful, but not uncertain. "It is built on something that no longer exists," she said, her tone unchanged, still calm, still precise, as if she were describing something obvious, something that should have been seen earlier. Ethan leaned back again, but this time it was different, not relaxed, not dismissive, but thoughtful, as if the ground beneath his certainty had shifted just enough to demand attention. Around the table, no one spoke, no one interrupted, because something more important than hierarchy had taken hold, the quiet recognition that truth, when it appeared, did not always come from where it was expected. Ethan glanced briefly at the documents in front of him, then back at her, and for the first time, there was no trace of dismissal in his eyes. "Who are you?" he asked, not sharply, not rhetorically, but genuinely, as if the answer mattered more than the question he had asked earlier. Lily hesitated, not out of fear, but because the question itself seemed misplaced, and when she spoke, her voice remained as steady as before. "I am just doing my job," she said. And somehow, that answer changed the room even more than the first one. The words settled in a way no one expected, not dramatic, not loud, but undeniable, and for a brief moment, the room did not know how to move forward, because the usual rhythm had been broken, the hierarchy disrupted by something that could not be dismissed or ignored. Ethan studied her longer this time, not as a challenge to overcome, but as a variable he had not accounted for, and that alone made him pause. Around the table, the executives shifted again, but differently now, their posture less rigid, their attention no longer fixed on impressing him, but on understanding what had just happened. One of them finally spoke, carefully. "If the baseline is wrong, then the entire strategy needs to be rebuilt," and his voice carried a quiet realization that echoed what everyone else was thinking but had not yet said. Ethan did not respond immediately, his gaze still resting on Lily, as if the answer to something larger was standing right in front of him, hidden in plain sight. "What would you do?" he asked, the question directed at her without hesitation, without the slightest trace of irony, and that alone caused a subtle shift across the room, because it was not a test anymore, it was a request. Lily did not rush to answer. She glanced briefly at the data on the nearest screen, then back at him, her expression unchanged, her voice steady. "I would stop trying to predict stability where there is none," she said, and the simplicity of her words made a few people straighten in their seats, because it was not complex, not layered in jargon, just clear. She continued, "You are asking the wrong question because you are trying to force certainty into a system that has already moved on." Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, not in disagreement, but in focus, as if each word was being measured against something deeper. "Then what is the right question?" he asked, leaning forward just a fraction, the kind of movement that usually went unnoticed, but not now. Lily held his gaze for a moment, then answered, "What adapts fastest when conditions change?" And this time, the silence that followed felt different, not heavy, not tense, but open, as if the room itself had shifted direction. Someone at the far end nodded slowly. Another leaned back, absorbing it, and the earlier tension dissolved into something quieter, something closer to clarity. Ethan exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping once against the table before going still again. And for the first time since the meeting began, he looked away from the center of the table and toward the screens, toward the data, as if seeing it from a new angle. "Run adaptive scenarios," he said, his voice calm, decisive, but changed, and immediately the room responded, not out of pressure, but alignment, as if a new path had just been drawn. Lily stepped back slightly, her role in the moment already fading in her own mind, as if what she had said did not belong to her anymore, but to the room. Ethan glanced back at her once more, briefly, and there was something unspoken in that look, not gratitude, not yet, but recognition, the kind that does not need to be announced. And as the screens updated and the numbers shifted into something that finally made sense, one quiet truth settled over everyone present, not spoken, but understood all the same, that the most important voice in the room had been the one no one thought to hear. The room moved again, but now it moved differently, not with the urgency of proving something, but with the quiet precision of people who had just seen a clearer path. Screens shifted, projections recalculated, and conversations that once felt rehearsed now carried a different tone, one shaped by correction rather than assumption. Ethan remained seated, watching it unfold, his expression composed, but his attention no longer scattered across the room. It stayed anchored, returning again and again to the same place, to the same person who had already stepped back into the edges of the scene. Lily had resumed her place without announcement, lifting the tray again, adjusting a glass slightly out of alignment, as if nothing had happened, as if the shift in direction had not started with her voice. One of the executives hesitated before speaking, glancing briefly in her direction, Then back at Ethan. We should revise the timeline as well, he said, more cautiously now, and Ethan nodded once. A simple gesture, but one that carried agreement rather than authority. The difference did not go unnoticed. Another analyst leaned forward, pointing at the updated figures. If we follow adaptive modeling, the margin improves by at least 12% over the next quarter. And this time, the numbers were not questioned, not immediately, because they had already learned what happened when something was taken for granted. Ethan stood slowly, not abruptly, not to reclaim control, but to observe more closely, his movement drawing subtle attention without demanding it. He walked toward the nearest screen, eyes scanning the data, but his mind remained somewhere else. Replaying not the calculations, but the moment they changed. He glanced over his shoulder, his voice steady. What did you say your name was? The question reached Lily just as she set down another glass, and for a fraction of a second, she paused, not out of surprise, but out of habit, as if names were not something she was often asked for in rooms like this. Lily, she said, her tone simple, without emphasis, without expectation. Ethan nodded once, repeating it quietly, almost to himself, as if committing it to memory rather than acknowledging it aloud. Lily, he said again, and then he turned back to the screen, but something had already shifted in the way he carried that name. Around the table, the atmosphere settled into something unfamiliar, not tense, not competitive, but aware, as if everyone had collectively stepped into a space where assumptions needed to be earned, not assumed. One of the partners, older, more reserved, looked toward Lily for a moment longer than necessary, then returned to his notes, adjusting them with a care that had not been there before. The meeting continued, but it no longer felt like a performance. It felt like a process, one shaped by correction, by listening, by the quiet understanding that insight did not follow titles. Lily moved again, passing behind the chairs, unnoticed in the way she had always been, yet somehow not invisible anymore, her presence carrying a weight that did not need to be acknowledged to be felt. Ethan watched the numbers settle into alignment, the projections stabilizing under a new approach, and for the first time that day, he allowed a small, almost imperceptible pause, not to speak, not to command, but simply to recognize what had just occurred. Because in a room built on expertise, it had taken someone without a seat at the table to reveal the truth that had been there all along. The meeting did not end with a clear signal, no decisive closing statement, no final word from Ethan to mark its conclusion. It simply softened, conversations lowering, screens dimming one by one, as if the room itself understood that something more important than a deal had just taken place. Chairs shifted back. Quietly, papers were gathered with unusual care, and the earlier urgency dissolved into a kind of thoughtful silence that lingered even as people began to stand. Ethan remained where he was for a moment longer than necessary, his gaze drifting across the table, not searching for answers anymore, but tracing the path of how they had changed. Across the room, Lily adjusted the last glass, aligning it with the others, her movements as precise and unassuming as they had been from the beginning, and then she turned slightly, ready to leave the space as quietly as she had entered it. Lily, Ethan said, and this time his voice did not carry authority, it carried intention, enough to stop her without startling her. She turned back, her expression calm, waiting, not expecting anything, not assuming anything. The room, though already dispersing, seemed to slow again, as if drawn back into a moment it did not want to miss. Ethan stepped away from the table, closing the distance between them, not as a CEO approaching a server, but as a man trying to understand something he had overlooked. "Where did you learn to see that?" he asked, his tone even, but quieter than before, as if the answer mattered beyond the context of the meeting. Lily did not answer immediately, her eyes meeting his for a brief second before shifting slightly, not out of discomfort, but reflection, as if choosing what to say required more care than the question itself. "From listening," she said simply, and the answer, though short, seemed to carry more weight than anything else spoken that day. Ethan studied her, the words settling in a way that did not feel complete, not yet, as if there was more behind them, something unspoken that he could not quite reach. "You do more than listen," he said, not as a challenge, but as an observation, and for a moment, it almost sounded like respect. Lily gave a small shake of her head, not dismissive, but grounding. Most people talk to be heard, she replied. Very few listen to understand. The room, now half empty, held on to her words longer than it should have, the remaining executives pausing just enough to let them register before continuing toward the door. Ethan exhaled slowly, a faint shift in his posture, as if something in him had adjusted, not dramatically, but permanently. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a simple card, not as a gesture of power, but as an offer, and held it out to her. If you ever want to do more than this, he said, his voice steady, call me. Lily looked at the card, then back at him, not taking it immediately, not rejecting it either, just considering it in the same quiet way she had approached everything else. After a moment, she accepted it, her fingers brushing the edge lightly, and gave a small nod, not a promise, not a commitment, just acknowledgement. Thank you, she said, her tone unchanged, still calm, still grounded. Ethan stepped back, giving her space, and for the first time that day, he did not add anything more. Lily slipped the card into her apron, turned, and walked toward the exit, her steps soft against the floor, her presence fading once again into the background she had always occupied. But this time, no one mistook it for absence, because something had shifted in how they saw her, and more importantly, in how they would see the next quiet voice that chose to speak. The hallway outside the conference room felt quieter than it should have been, as if the walls themselves were holding on to what had just happened inside, refusing to let it disappear too quickly. Lily moved through it with the same steady pace, her shoes soft against the polished floor, her eyes forward, not rushing, not lingering, simply continuing as she always did. The card in her apron pocket felt lighter than it should have, almost weightless, yet impossible to ignore, a small presence that carried more meaning than its size suggested. Behind her, the door opened again, not loudly, but enough to send a subtle echo down the corridor, and footsteps followed, measured, deliberate, not hurried, but intentional. Lily, Ethan's voice came again, closer this time, not calling her back to a role, but to a conversation that had not quite finished. She slowed, then stopped, turning just enough to face him without fully stepping back, maintaining a distance that felt natural, unforced. Ethan stood a few feet away, his jacket unbuttoned now, his posture less rigid than before, as if something in him had adjusted without announcement. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence no longer uncomfortable, but reflective, as if both understood that whatever came next mattered in a different way. You said you learned by listening, he began, his tone even, but thoughtful. But people do not usually hear what you heard in that room. Lily's gaze shifted slightly, not avoiding him, but considering the question behind his words. They hear it, she said quietly. They just do not trust it. Ethan studied her expression, searching for something more, something that explained how she had reached conclusions others had missed, but what he found instead was calm, not guarded, not defensive, just steady. And you do? He asked. Lily gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. I trust patterns, she replied, not opinions. The answer lingered, simple on the surface, but layered beneath, and Ethan let it settle before speaking again. You were not guessing, he said, more to confirm than to question. No, she answered, just as directly, without emphasis, without pride. Another pause followed, not empty, but full of things unsaid, the kind that did not need to be filled immediately. In the distance, an elevator chimed softly, a reminder that the world outside this moment continued as usual, even if something here had shifted. Ethan glanced briefly down the hallway, then back at her, his expression no longer analytical, but certain in a different way. You should not be invisible, he said, the words measured, not forceful, but clear. Lily's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, more like acknowledgement, as if she had heard this before, or perhaps understood it differently. I am not, she said, and for the first time, there was something just beneath her calm, not defiance, not resistance, but quiet confidence. Ethan held her gaze a second longer, then nodded once, accepting the answer without pushing further, as if he recognized that understanding her did not mean defining her. Lily turned then, continuing down the hallway, her pace unchanged, her presence once again blending into the rhythm of the building, unnoticed by those who did not know what to look for. Ethan remained where he was, watching her disappear around the corner, the space she left behind not empty, but altered, carrying the quiet echo of a realization that did not need to be spoken to remain true. The elevator doors closed with a soft chime, and just like that, the moment seemed to dissolve into the ordinary rhythm of the building, but something about it refused to fade completely. Ethan stood in the hallway a few seconds longer than he ever allowed himself to linger, his gaze fixed on the empty space where Lily had just disappeared, as if the silence she left behind still carried answers he had not yet fully understood. He turned slowly, walking back toward the conference room, his steps measured, but his thoughts no longer aligned with the routine that had defined him for years. Inside, the room had almost reset itself, screens dimmed, chairs pushed in, traces of the meeting reduced to scattered notes and half-empty glasses, but the atmosphere remained altered, quieter, more aware. One of his senior partners looked up as he re-entered, hesitation flickering across his face before settling into something more respectful than before. "We will have the revised projections by morning," he said, his tone careful, as if precision now mattered in a different way. Ethan nodded once, but his attention drifted past him, toward the far corner where Lily had stood earlier, the place that now seemed far more significant than the head of the table he had occupied. He walked to the window, the city stretching below in its usual brilliance, cars moving in steady lines, people crossing streets with purpose, a system that looked stable from a distance but shifted constantly underneath. For years, he had built his success on seeing patterns before others did, on predicting outcomes, on controlling variables. But now, something about that certainty felt incomplete, not wrong, but limited. He exhaled slowly, his reflection in the glass looking back at him with a clarity he had not expected, as if he was seeing himself from a different angle for the first time. Behind him, the last of the team gathered their things, voices low, movements deliberate, each person carrying a quiet awareness that the day had not gone as planned, but perhaps had gone exactly as it needed to. Ethan turned back toward the table, his gaze steady, his voice calm, but changed. "From now on," he said, and the room stilled again, not out of pressure, but attention. "We question the question before we chase the answer." No one argued, no one hesitated, because the lesson had already been learned. He picked up a glass, then set it down again without drinking, a small motion, but one that reflected the shift in his thinking, the pause before action that had not existed before. Hours later, as the building emptied and the city lights grew sharper against the dark, Ethan remained in his office, the silence no longer something to fill, but something to use. On his desk, the notes from the meeting lay open, but his focus was elsewhere, on a single detail that did not belong to any report, any projection, any strategy. A name. Lily. He repeated it quietly, not as a question, but as recognition, and for the first time in a long time, he understood that some of the most valuable insights were not found in boardrooms or data sets, but in the voices that no one thought to hear. Somewhere below, far beyond the glass and steel, the city continued its endless motion, unaware that in one quiet room above it, the definition of power had just changed without a single raised voice. Morning arrived without announcement, just a gradual shift in light across the glass walls of the office, the city below already awake, already moving, already chasing answers to questions most people had not stopped to examine. Ethan stood by the window again, not out of habit this time, but out of thought, his reflection faint against the skyline, his posture still, composed, but different in a way that could not be measured on any report. On his desk, the revised projections waited, clean, precise, corrected, the numbers now aligned with reality rather than assumption, and yet, they were not what held his attention. It was the absence of something, or rather, the presence of something he had not been looking for before. He picked up the report, scanning it quickly, confirming what he already knew, then set it down without hesitation, as if the answer it provided was no longer the most important part of the equation. Across town, in a quiet corner of a small cafe attached to the building, Lily moved between tables with the same steady rhythm, her expression calm, her focus simple, her presence blending into the background of conversations and morning routines. Nothing about her movement suggested the shift she had created the day before. No sign of recognition, no expectation of it. A customer asked for more coffee, another for the check, and she responded the same way she always had, attentive, precise, unassuming. The card remained in her apron, untouched since the moment she placed it there, not forgotten, but not acted upon, either. Back upstairs, Ethan turned from the window, his decision forming not as a sudden impulse, but as a quiet conclusion, the kind that did not require justification. He walked out of his office without calling for an assistant, without scheduling anything, his steps direct, his mind clear. When he entered the cafe, the sound of low conversation and the soft clink of cups greeted him, a different world from the silence of the boardroom, but no less structured in its own way. Lily noticed him only when he reached the counter, her eyes lifting briefly, recognizing him without surprise, without reaction beyond a simple acknowledgement. "Good morning," she said, her tone the same as it had always been, neutral, present. Ethan nodded once, not taking a seat immediately, not rushing into explanation, just standing there for a moment as if adjusting to a space where titles carried less weight. "You were right," he said finally, not loudly, not for anyone else to hear, just enough for her. And the words did not sound like a concession, but like understanding. Lily did not respond right away. She poured coffee into a cup, set it gently on the counter, then looked at him again, her expression unchanged, her calm unbroken. "It was not about being right," she said quietly. "It was about seeing what was already there." Ethan considered that, the simplicity of it, the clarity, and for a moment, the distance between their worlds felt smaller than it ever had. He reached into his jacket, not for a card this time, but for nothing at all, his hand stopping halfway before dropping back to his side, as if realizing something he had not understood the day before. Some things could not be offered. Some things had to be recognized. He gave a small nod, not as a conclusion, but as acceptance, and turned to leave without asking another question, without making another offer.